Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And here's Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Good morning, Dr. Ostrower.
Good morning to you, Brian.
Well, Dr. Ostrower, I want to get to current events, but before we do, if we could start out with a little this day in history. This is right up your alley from 1974. I know you remember this one. Some of the Watergate tapes, the Nixon tapes, I guess they're called, came out, and I'm reading from the History Channel's website. Under coercion from the U.S. Supreme Court, President Nixon releases subpoenaed White House recordings suspected to prove his guilt in the Watergate scandal. I would play some of those, and legally I could. They're on YouTube, but they're also on the Nixon Library. I would play some of those, but the audio is not all that great, and you often have to, if you listen to the Nixon tapes, which I've listened to a lot of those, you have to read the text that goes along with it in order to be able to understand it, because Nixon is talking to Haldeman and different people, and the recordings aren't the best. Dr. Ostrower, your thoughts on this day in history, 1974? Some of the Nixon tapes come out.
Well, the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 decision, and that 9-0 decision was rendered by justices, some of whom were appointed by Democrats, some of whom were appointed by Republicans, such as Dwight Eisenhower. It was a unanimous decision, and because it was a unanimous decision, I think it carried a degree of weight that it otherwise might not have. And I guess the point that I would want to stress here is that back during the 1970s, the Supreme Court was not as partisan as I'm afraid it's becoming today. And by the same token, even the Senate was not as partisan as it is today. The Senate today will defend Donald Trump regardless of the crimes that he has committed. Back in 1974, the Senate, I'm talking about Republicans in the Senate, were not willing to back up President Nixon regardless of those crimes. And therefore, when the tapes were finally released at the end of July, it was only about 9 days later, maybe 8 days later, that Nixon was forced to resign. It was a very, very important moment. And while we're talking about this day in history, let me mention one other thing which I kind of find interesting. And that is that back in 1965, on this day in history, Medicare, President Lyndon Johnson, signed the Medicare bill. Medicare had been proposed initially back in the 1930s, or at least the equivalent of Medicare. And the American Medical Association, along with some other doctors' groups, fought it tooth and nail because they feared that it would, to one extent or another, limit their, if you will, their income, their profitability, and so forth. And it came back again after the war. President Truman had suggested it, had proposed it. It was once again opposed by the American Medical Association, and the basis on which it was opposed was that it was socialism. You know, it was socialized medicine. Even though every single European country, including all of our allies during World War II, had already adopted the equivalent of Medicare, it was opposed here because it was supposedly socialistic. And the word socialism had come to become kind of a a very, very hot item during much of the 20th century. Social Security was opposed because it was supposedly socialist. Obviously, Medicare and a number of other things, even the GI Bill by some Republicans. And I think that we just have to step back and be a little bit more, how shall I put it, maybe a little bit less ideological when it comes to assessing the importance of things like expanding the Medicare program or Medicaid or any number of other social programs, not the least of which would be those programs which might relieve the debt burden for those students who are under $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt from their years in college. In any case, there's always a lot of stuff going on there in this day in history, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Nixon tapes.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting to listen to. You can get them from the Nixon Library. You can get them on YouTube. And it's a very telling about that period. the late 1960s through the early 1970s. I want to get back to this day in history, but we have current events that I'm sure that you're chomping at the bit to get to Dr. Ostrower with Baltimore.
Well, I would like to say something about Baltimore, but before I do, again, if I can
Sure.
touch on the Nixon tapes.
Oh, sure,
they
go
are
ahead.
also in the National Archives. And if you get to the National Archives in Washington, you can go up to the main reading room, you put on a pair of earphones, and you can listen to them. You're right, Brian, the sound quality is not always great. But if you're at the National Archives, you're likely to hear a somewhat clearer rendition of that than you are on YouTube. So far as the issue of Baltimore is concerned, I don't necessarily want to say very much about Representative Elijah Cummings, but I do want to say something about that President Trump's attack on Cummings and his attack on Baltimore. We've had approximately 230 years of American presidential history. Okay, there have been good days and there have been bad days. We've just been talking about Nixon, who certainly doesn't come out of the presidency with a lot of credit. But we have never had a president who has been as deliberately divisive as President Trump. And you see it, of course, in his attack on the 4 Democratic Congresswomen. You see it in his attack on Baltimore. Again, is that racist? Is that not? To most Democrats, of course, it's racist. To most Republicans, of course, it's not racist because he never explicitly raised the subject of race. But the fact of the matter is that whether it's Baltimore or whether it was Chicago during the campaign, he's a very, very divisive president. And I think that, historically, one should credit those presidents who try to one extent or another, to bring the nation together, to knit us together as a single people. We call ourselves a melting pot, and I think there's good reason for that. And I find that in the current administration, the divisiveness, the anger that is displayed by the president, his pettiness, his vindictiveness, none of that is going to serve us well in the long run. Okay, that's all I have to say about Baltimore. The other thing I'd like to just note is that yesterday the president did sign, to his credit, a bill which is providing aid to first responders during the 9/11 attack. That was stalled in Congress. The Republicans in Congress, for reasons that are simply, murky to me at least, had refused to support it. Jon Stewart, the comedian, who was a Trump critic, became probably the most important single reason why, given his support for that bill, when he testified before Congress recently, why the bill finally was moved forward. And I thought it was kind of sad that of all the people who were not invited to the White House ceremony yesterday, Jon Stewart was included in that group. He was not there. Of course he should have been there. Once again, to make things like this into a partisan issue, I think, is just a sad commentary on where we are today.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. I was wondering, Dr. Ostrower, have you followed the back and forth between Kentucky Senator Ron Paul and Congresswoman Omar?
I have not, so maybe you're going to have to fill me in on this one, Brian.
Okay, let's see. I pulled this one up. This one, let's see, is from Fox News. Senator Rand Paul had been putting up, I'm not sure if it was Twitter, but he had been putting out statements saying that, and this is following what Congressman or President Trump had said about members of the squad should go back where they came from and fix things up, and then come back and show us how it's done. Rand Paul said in an interview with Breitbart News he would be willing to contribute to buy Congresswoman Omar of Minnesota a plane ticket to go visit Somalia. Then she can learn about the disaster that is Somalia. And she tweeted back, and let me find... Well, among other things, she put back a pretty tough tweet, and then what she said was she could understand why Rand Paul's neighbor attacked him. And then she shared, Congresswoman Omar shared a Tom Arnold, the actor-comedian tweet, which made reference to a lawnmower attack. So things are getting pretty heated in these back and forths between Congresswoman Omar and Senator Rand Paul. And excuse me for the dead air. I did not research this question ahead of time.
Well, look, as I say, I really am unfamiliar with the exchange between those two. Look, Congresswoman Omar is not my favorite member of Congress. Having said that, you don't attack the loyalty of those who are, not just members of Congress. You don't attack the loyalty of Americans generally. Once upon a time, we accepted, Democrats and Republicans, the notion of a loyal opposition. Okay, people might disagree with you, but nevertheless, you didn't attack their fundamental loyalty, their patriotism. Today, we seem to be doing that. At least the Republicans seem to be doing that, and certainly, from what you've just read, it sounds as if that's what Rand Paul is doing. If in fact that's correct, I think that he should be criticized for that quite justly. But I want to make another comment, which is kind of related to the subject of race, and it has nothing to do with members of Congress as such. In 1955, there was a young man, 14 years old, black, in Mississippi, who was murdered. He was lynched. His name was Emmett Till. Some of our older listeners may remember that name, and he's lately come back, so to speak, into the news. There is a plaque in Mississippi, in the town in which he was killed, and practically the place where he was murdered, that commemorates that. It was a disgraceful episode in American Southern history. And that plaque itself has been attacked by the KKK, which has put KKK initials on it. It's been shot up by, there are a number of bullet holes in it. And just last week, there were 3 young men from the University of Mississippi who posed smiling in front of that plaque holding AR-14s or AR-15s. Racism remains intact in some areas of this country, and I think it's a sad commentary. So where does all that come from? And the fact, as a historian, I want to remind people that we have a long, long history that goes all the way back to the earliest years of American history. When I say the earliest years, we should remember that Jamestown, the colony of Jamestown, was founded in 1607 by the British. Initially, it was not even to be a permanent settlement. But once tobacco was developed there, it became a much wealthier community than had been anticipated, and for that reason, the British decided that they would make it into a permanent settlement. So they began to export women from England to Jamestown because that would, of course, provide the basis for family life and presumably make it more attractive. And because the death rate in Jamestown was so very, very high in part because people grew tobacco. Okay, some of the settlers grew tobacco rather than food, and that was because tobacco was so very, very valuable as an export. But, it was kind of self-defeating. And so the death rate in Jamestown was around 75%. In other words, if you were alive this year, 75% of you would be dead by the following year. And so the British they instituted what we call private property. They began to give people private property that they certainly would not have had in England itself. And a few years after that, in 1619, and I remind you that 1619 is 1 year before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock. In 1619, the first Africans were imported into Virginia, and that was because Virginia needed or at least the officers of the settlement believed that Virginia needed a labor force. Okay, a labor force that was larger than that which they had because of that high death rate. And so they began to import the Africans. That, of course, developed into slavery. And that slavery has become a part of American history. By 1770, just before the American Revolution, there were approximately 700,000 slaves in the colonies in what's going to become the United States. A few years after that, by 1810, that number had bloomed up to approximately 1,200,000. So slavery was very, very much a part of the American past. And there's another element to that which is kind of interesting. I mean, we tend to think of the American Revolution as a revolution for freedom. Yes, it was a revolution for freedom and independence. Those things are not synonymous. It was a revolution for freedom for whites, but not for blacks. And if you read the Declaration of Independence carefully, you'll notice, of course, it's ringing phrases by Jefferson about all men are created equal and so forth. But by the same token, Jefferson was a slave owner, owned about 250 to 300 slaves. George Washington was a slave owner. Of the first 16 American presidents, 9 of them were slave owners. And I guess the point I want to make is that the American Revolution, in part, was an attempt on the part of American colonists to secure slavery because the British, the abolitionist movement, the anti-slave movement in Britain was picking up steam, and there were a lot of Americans who were fearful that if the colonies remained British, that slavery would disappear.
That is a little-known fact, I think, what you just brought up, Dr. Gary Ostrower. I have a question about the slavery period. The Underground Railroad, which was the anti-slavery movement, how big was that? You know, if you could tell us maybe in terms of a percentage, how many people were involved, and if they were not involved, how many were sympathetic to it?
Well, that's a tough question because we certainly didn't have
I'm just throwing
like
that
public
at you,
opinion polling and so forth back in that period. In the North, there was a great deal of sympathy. There was also a lot of hostility to it. During the 1830s, for instance, 30 years before the Civil War, there were anti-slavery riots. That is to say, riots in opposition to abolitionism, riots in opposition to those people who were arguing the case for anti-slavery. And I mean riots in little towns right here in upstate New York in what we used to call the burned-over district. So, it was a very, very divisive issue from, 1787 when the Constitution was finally was written and then adopted, right until the beginning of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, the Constitution itself was a compromise document. Northerners, for instance, for the most part, wanted slaves not to be counted for the purposes of Southern representation in Congress. Southerners, of course, wanted all the slaves to be counted, and so they compromised, not at 50-50. In other words, not, all right, we'll count slaves as 1/2 of a human being, but rather as 3/5 of a human being. A fugitive slave law was placed right into the Constitution. The slave trade was permitted by the Constitution. So there's a lot of stuff in there that, suggests that even during the late 1700s, the issue of slavery was very divisive. But so far as the Underground Railroad is concerned, we're talking about hundreds, not thousands upon thousands of slaves who escaped from the South. The Southerners, white Southerners, had slave patrols. Every single male was required in some states to serve in those anti-slave, in slave patrols to find escaped slaves and whatnot. And to the extent that the Underground Railroad was effective, it was effective in the upper areas of the South, in slaves from Maryland, slaves from Virginia, or at least what then becomes West Virginia, slaves from Kentucky, for instance, but it had virtually no presence whatsoever in the Deep South, such as in Louisiana or in Alabama, where it really counted in the sense that there were many, many, many more slaves there than there were in the Upper South.
Very interesting answer. Dr. Gary Ostrower, our guest this morning on the Newsmaker Show. Oh, I'm way late on the break. We'll skip the weather. We won't do the weather call. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back to finish up with Dr. Ostrower. 30 seconds. Stay with us.
It's where you get answers to important questions. It's where you get the most advanced care. It's where you are. The UR Medicine Women's Imaging and Breast Center is now in Hornell, so you can get 3D mammograms, breast ultrasound, biopsies, and DEXA scans, all at the Hornell Medical Office Building, right where you are. For an appointment, call 607-324-8279. The UR Medicine Women's Imaging and Breast Center, part of St. James Hospital.
Now we're in the history section with Dr. Gary Ostrower on Newsmaker. Dr. Ostrower, let's imagine the British had won the American Revolution. What happens to slavery?
I think that slavery would have disappeared much earlier than it did. The British, by 1833, had eliminated slavery throughout their entire empire, whereas, of course, we know in the United States, as a result of the Civil War, it was not going to be until 1865 that slavery would disappear. As a matter of fact, the United States was the largest slave-owning country in the entire world during the 19th century. Only Brazil and only Cuba maintained slavery after the United States had eliminated it in 1865. But as they say, had the British won the American Revolution, in all likelihood, the abolitionist movement would have been stronger. My guess is that by roughly speaking, by about 1833, 1834, 1835, slavery would have disappeared. But that's very iffy history. We really don't know. There would have been a lot of support, of course, even if the British were here among British slave owners. And I might add one last thing here. There was a British official by the name of Lord Dunmore during the American Revolution. And what he said during the Revolution is that if any slaves come over to the British side, he will guarantee their freedom. And he did. So quite a number of slaves from Virginia defected to the British. By the same token, and to show you how complex history is, Lord Dunmore was himself, in some of his properties, he was a slave owner. So go figure.
History is a complicated, sometimes ugly thing, but very interesting. Dr. Gary Ostrower, as always, thank you so much for coming on with us.
Brian, thanks for having me here this morning, and I'll see you guys next week.